You're listening to Data Talks, the podcast from Data in Schools, in association with Atlanta International School and the Mona Lisa Effect, and sponsored by Veracross and IntelliSchool.
I'm Paul Swanson, Director of Innovation and Institutional Research at Atlanta International School and part of the Data in Schools team.
And I'm Matthew Savage, educator, leader, consultant, and coach.
On this podcast, we'll be talking to leaders and users of data in schools across the world, looking for the best ways to ensure that we measure what really matters. So welcome to our podcast, the place where data talks and we listen.
And on today's episode, we're talking to Chris Smith. Chris is currently a K-12 Learning and Innovation Coach at the American Community School of Abu Dhabi. He's also the founder of Smith Visualizations and of Data in Schools, and specialises in transforming complex academic data into actionable information, enabling school leaders and educators to make effective, data-driven decisions.
So, Chris, welcome to Data Talks.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm ready to get going on this.
So let's just kick it off. Chris, based on your experience, what would you say is data?
What is data? Geez, that's pretty broad. Anything and everything.
Well, there's an important point here, though, isn't there? We talk about all of these things in education without necessarily getting clarity about what it is we're even talking about. And, you know, everyone talks about being data-informed and data-fed and data-led, etc., without necessarily reaching a consensus around what data is. So, you're one of the founders of Data in Schools. So what is data in schools, I guess?
Yeah, I think for me, the way it started out was the most common thing when it comes to data as far as educators are concerned, in my opinion, relates to academics. That seems to be the easiest way to understand data because that's what teachers seem to relate with and what they're dealing with. That's what connects them to their students and to parents and to the school as a whole. But we also know as educators, longtime educators, that that's not the only thing that data is in schools, right? We have relationships, we have program data, we have community data, we have data that whether depending on the type of school, you might have financial data, you have attendance data. There's all these different things that can be data within a school, within an institution. It's really hard to pinpoint it just down to one thing. It's really, as you say, Matthew, it's this constellation of dots that we're trying to connect because schools are these ecosystems that are intertwined and complex. And so data, yeah, it's a lot, right?
When you think about data, though, Chris, I imagine that you sometimes think about it in different ways than the educators that you're talking with. What are some of the ways in which you find that some of the principals or teachers or coaches or coordinators, they may think about data in a different way than you have, having worked with it?
I guess the one thing that I often encounter, and I think most of us probably have encountered it with certain teachers, is this fear around data. Like that they don't, they just fear it for whatever reason, maybe not even knowing what it is, but for whatever reason they fear it because it seems to be something that's abstract and that they can't relate to. And I wonder if that's because when they've been presented with data, it's been presented to them in some format that is hard for them to interpret. So it could be a spreadsheet, it could be a PDF file with a bunch of numbers and boxes, and it could be charts that they don't know how to read that aren't annotated very well. Who knows what it could be, right? But it's presented as data to them. And because it's not presented in a way that's easy to interpret, or easy to understand, or easy to inform, they become scared, or they don't like it, or there's this immediate desire to not want to deal with it. And so when I look at this, the lens that I come from, luckily having a bit more of an analytical background and a background in data visualization, is my biggest thing is, okay, how can we take this data, this information, and present it in a way that's easily accessible to whoever needs to see it? And so we want to break down the barrier, break down the friction of the actual data itself into making it accessible, making it informative, and making it useful. And so when I take a look at data, I think about it through the lens of the user. Who needs this? Who's the audience? What do they need? How do they need it? What are the questions that they have? And how can I take that information and give it to them in in a way that hopefully provides some insights, but also gets them to ask more questions.
Can we dive into the fear a bit more there that you talked about? Because I think that's really real. We've probably all seen that amongst colleagues and educators around the world, right? People are scared of data. And I totally get what you said about access, right? If something doesn't feel accessible to me, then I'm going to probably be scared of that thing. But it's why I asked more about what data is as well, because the purpose of something is going to influence whether I embrace it or whether I run from it. And you talked at the start about academic data being the thing that we often begin with. And if it's academic data, why? What's the purpose of that? Is the purpose of that accountability? Do we have academic data so that our line manager, our administrators can figure out whether we're doing a good enough job or not? Why, when a kid's scared of data, is it because they're trying to see whether the data will show that they're enough for their teacher? You know, when a head of school is scared of data, is it that they're worried that when the board looks at the data, they will decide that the head of school isn't doing a good enough job? So as well as the access piece, do you think there's a kind of a purpose alignment thing that needs to go on there, which is, I suppose, why we started out by asking what data is and why, I suppose, data is? That's a short question for you, Chris.
Thank you. And I think they're very valid. No, those are all valid, right? That's what it is. The reason why I started with academic data is I think that throughout history, as we have humans that are going into education that grow up and turn into adults and then create humans of their own that go through the education system, the one thing that connects them, no matter whatever the evolution and the changes are within education, is oh, how are you doing, right? Have you learned stuff or not? And as a teacher or as a parent, I'm looking at that and saying, okay, you've either done well or you haven't done well, so you've learned or you haven't, and that's related to academics. And so there's that through line that makes it makes it easier for people to communicate, no matter where they're coming from, whether that be a parent, an administrator, a student, a teacher, a board member. We know what academics mean. You don't have to explain what academics are in most situations. And so I think that you hit the nail on the head when you're talking about accountability. I know things have changed and systems have changed, but I still think that there are still some systems where there is this level of accountability on whether students have made success or not. I know in the States, back in the 2000s, that was huge, this No Child Left Behind thing, where schools were given funding based off of test scores, and so the better they did, the more money they received. So there was this massive accountability. So then there was a shift from teaching students to teaching to the test, and that made the teachers accountable. And then when the data came back about how the students did, if it wasn't good data, then it was a problem, right? There was this fear. I think that generated that fear again. So I wonder if that is not the only instance, but maybe one instance on why there is fear.
Do we need to decouple them somehow then? I wonder, because the access piece is really important, it seems to me. And one of the reasons I love Paul's work is that he really focuses on how the data is received and how it's experienced. And so the access is, apparently not everyone likes spreadsheets, I'm told, but I don't struggle to believe that myself, but apparently not everyone does. But in all seriousness, if you hate number, if you've grown up in school anxious about math, and then suddenly you're given numbers, then unless it's packaged in a way that it's accessible, you're going to be scared of that. But I just wonder whether that decoupling piece is important. What do you think, Paul?
Well, there's a lot of threads here which I would love to pick on, and one of the sort of the themes going through that conversation is the idea of judgment and evaluation, and using data for judgment and evaluation. I think there's actually a positive and a negative sense about this. I think data at its best can actually help us see our blind spots. It can help us see where it is that we actually aren't doing what it is that we thought that we were doing well. One of the great pieces of data, this comes from some of Jim Knight's work, he was asking teachers how many questions they thought they asked in a given lesson. And they thought about 15. And how many questions do you think the students ask? Oh, maybe 14, 13, but it should be 15. And then when they looked at the data, they found out the teachers asked 50 questions and the kids asked 2. And there is sort of like a self-evaluative quality of that, where the teacher is interested in knowing about their questioning, and then they receive data that shows them that they're actually not doing what they thought they were doing, that gap between perception and reality, and that they can work to close it. It feels different when somebody else is doing it. It feels a lot scarier when your boss is doing it than when you're doing it. And it feels even scarier, to your point, Chris, when like some unknown shadowy government official is evaluating your school like that. But I think there's positive, and then there's also, Matthew, you talk a lot in your work about the idea of data harm, right? And the ways in which data is used to label and to create negative self-perceptions about kids and teachers and everybody else. And it feels like these are sort of like the evil twin of one is the evil twin of the other. If it's done in a trustful, positive way, it can help us find those blind spots. And if it's not, it can just be used to rip people apart.
Yeah, I think it's a tool of sorting, isn't it? Oftentimes, and there's something without needing to darken the mood. There's something almost eugenicist about how data is sometimes used. It's to sort, to rank, to decide who has more value and worth and who has less. There's definitely an evil twin. Where have you seen this evil twin at play, Chris?
Well, I wanted to, before getting into that, I wanted to bring up something that actually Professor Sandra Milligan brought up at the conference that we just recently had at the University of Melbourne. Sandra does this work around new metrics or Melbourne metrics, as they're called, different ways of measuring student success. But she often talked about how schools have far too much data, and the data that we're looking at it through a very narrow lens, and we're not looking at it broad enough. And it's often used by the wrong people for the wrong reasons. And that kind of resonated with me when you're talking about that, how the using it for evil or using it for good. And so, yeah, it depends on like what's the purpose of it, right? Like why are we collecting this data and what are we going to do with it? What is the purpose of it? Is the purpose to help kids? Is the purpose to show growth, to encourage students to continue to find that desire to want to learn and want to find out new things? Or is it to prove that they haven't learned, and to put them on the spot and say, see, you weren't paying attention, you didn't learn anything? Like what's the purpose behind collecting that data and how is it used? So that's how I see as far as the evil twin thing playing out.
I think, what about sense making? Right? I think about a really young baby. I mean, my kids are in their 20s now, so this was a long time ago for me. But when a young baby first enters this overwhelming world, they're trying to make sense of it. And in order to make sense of it, they're trying to identify and process and understand the data available to them, to make sense of the world, to make sense of the people in their world. What they're doing the whole time is trying to sift and sort and understand and analyze and visualize all of that data, all of that information, so they can make sense of what otherwise might seem nonsensical, it might seem unfathomable, it might seem just too much. So if data then is a sense-making tool, doesn't that perhaps take us closer to the sort of data culture that you two are both talking about here? As an educator, I want to make sense of the stuff that I can't yet make sense of. Teenagers, for example, they're sometimes quite difficult to make sense of, right? There's chaos and there's mess, plenty. As a head of school, we've talked about, I want to make sense of this really complex community, diverse, intersecting, and messy, right? So if I want to make sense of something, there isn't that judgment, there isn't that value, there isn't that evil, shadowy twin. It's just a process we all embarked upon when we first entered the world. So I'm offering that as a metaphor, I suppose. Does that carry any weight?
Something about what you said there, I think, really resonates for me, that the metaphors that we use to describe data really affect how we understand it. And this sort of goes to my question to you, Chris, earlier, where we're talking about different ways that people think about data. Oftentimes, I find it when I talk with teachers, the idea of sensory data or sensory information is not what they think of when they think of data. When they hear the word data, they think of like spreadsheets and numbers and very quantitative types of data. But then there are these sort of adjacent words to data, like sensory observations, right? Or evidence, right? Evidence is another metaphor, of sort of like a courtroom, right? Where you're trying to make a case for something. Information, I think, is probably the most neutral of the words, but it has a certain dry quality, right? Like it feels very factual, right? When you talk about information. But all of these things are related. And I love that image, Matthew, about like, what does data mean for a baby? What is that experience and that sense making of their data? What do you think, Chris?
That definitely that metaphor of a child, I think that makes it easier to understand for maybe people that are having a hard time grappling with this, and myself included at the moment, because you really narrow the focus. And I think we've all experienced childhood. We've probably have interacted with children or watched children in some capacity as educators, and so we understand their limited world, right? And so you can kind of bottle it into that context and like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And it's not, the kid's not making tally marks and sticking them in a spreadsheet or anything. But they are taking these different points of interaction and observation, and then bringing it into what they already know, and then building their knowledge, and that's the data that they're collecting. So I think that's a good way to put it in order for people to understand. And I think that, as you said, Matthew, as far as instead of it being like this kind of evil twin, like there's probably good in both, right? We're just bringing data in and we're trying to make sense of the things that we don't know. And so as teachers or as educators, we're collecting information and collecting data about whether it be our students, our program, our school, our community, our parents. And we're trying to bring that in because assuming that we don't know or that there are blind spots, as you mentioned, Paul. And so how do we bring that in to help us do better? Whatever it is that we're trying to do, we want to use that to do better. When I talk with other schools and they ask for things and they ask, oh, we want you to do this, or we want you to do that, we want you to help build a system for this or for that, and I ask them why, they have a really hard time answering why. And I think that there's this notion that we have to, because there's data and we have to do something with it. We have data, so let's do something. And if there isn't a why, like, well, why are you doing something with that data? Like, do you already know what the answer is? Like, oh, we already know that our kids generally come to school and our attendance data is usually above 95%, but we want to collect attendance data. It's like, well, if that's a non-issue, then why are you doing that? You already know that. Like, why don't you? I don't know. So I often ask these questions and am faced with resistance. But because I think that's just what they know. And maybe that's the low-hanging fruit instead of spending the time really thinking about the why behind what they're doing.
Imagine a system that understands how independent schools work, where the soccer coach is also the algebra teacher, where parents are alumni, where everyone plays multiple roles. Most school software forces you to juggle separate systems for students, parents, alumni, donors, fragmenting the people you serve into disconnected data points. It's exhausting, and it misses what matters most. Veracross is different. One person, one record. Comprehensive software that connects every department with real-time data, all centered on the whole person. No silos, just seamless collaboration across your entire school. Veracross.com. Trusted by 3,200 schools worldwide. Imagine what you could achieve with data that works for good.
Part of the whole data in schools movement has been to try to help educators understand. Could you share just a little bit about the story of your organization, Data in Schools, where that came from, how it's grown, and where you see it going?
Yeah, so Data in Schools, this was a very organic thing. It came about as I moved from the classroom into ed tech into data analytics school-wide within a very large institution. I moved from this place of being surrounded by fellow educators that were doing the same thing. If I had a question about something, I wanted to share an idea, I could just go down the hall, and we had opportunities to engage with other teachers. Moving into ed tech was a different lens, but there were other ed tech coaches or coordinators around that shared that. When I moved into data analytics within the school, I felt very isolated and siloed. And I didn't feel like I had that network anymore. And so I started to reach out to other schools and ask, is there anybody else in your school that's doing this work? And try to build that network. And so kind of organically built a very small network to start out with. And then over time, that network eventually grew and grew. And as we grew, there was a desire to come back together and to talk more deeply about some of this work around what we're doing around data. And I think it's because when somebody asks, say, a data analyst within a school, like, oh, hey, what's your job? What do? You have to go through this whole 20-minute explanation process to even just kind of get to a general idea of what the job is. Whereas with data in schools, the people that are there already kind of know that, so you can just hop into whatever your problems are or whatever you want to share, and that language is universal, and we understand that language. And so that's kind of how it started out. We started out in Singapore. While we were in Singapore, then there was this desire to, we had schools from Europe that wanted to come and join, but they said it was expensive and far, and they asked us, well, can you come to Europe to do this? And it was all new to us, and we had no idea whether we could go there or not. We thought it'd be a great idea. We had no idea how we were going to fund it or finance it. Luckily, the things worked out. We went to Europe. We did this. And then after that, then it was another school asking, can you come to India? Can you come here? Can you come there? And it just kind of has snowballed into this thing. And we've been very lucky to have really good connections with a lot of very experienced educators around the world. And we have organizations that are also supporting us. But the demand is definitely, it has not decreased. It continues to grow. And so where's data in schools going? We've gone from a conference that we're running twice a year to most likely running it 3 times a year. At least this year and next year, it'll be 3 times a year. And then we anticipate also a couple of more localized community opportunities and events to be taking place in between conferences. And so we're trying to grow the kind of like the online network or the in-between conference community. And that's like why we're doing this podcast, and we've got some other events that we have coming up. And so we see it as like almost like at the beginning now, even though we've done this for a little bit, but we see it as a beginning and kind of a new wave as far as where we're going, because the demand continues to increase as time goes on.
Can I ask a question about your constituency then? In that sense, you've grown, right? You've grown in terms of number of schools. You've grown in terms of number of countries in which you've, offered conferences and events. Your online networks are growing. Are you also growing in terms of role? Because you talked initially about how the initial impetus lay, at least in part, in data analysts in a school wanting to be able to talk with other people doing data analytics in their school, and that's so important, isn't it, to have those networks of like-minded people doing similar things across different contexts. And then a lot of your community are tech leads in some ways. You kind of had the crossover between those two roles. Are you noticing that the bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger it all becomes, that you're getting other roles coming on board and bringing with them what they are doing, they might not be, they might see data analytics as the furthest from their wheelhouse possible. They might think that they're the worst person with tech, but they still feel that they've got something really fresh and important to say about data. Another short question from me here, master of the short questions, clearly. Mm-hmm. Do you see the type of delegate evolving as well as the number of delegates, I suppose?
Yeah, for sure. Like when we first started out, it was 14 of us, and we were all data analytics people in the room. That was it, or a tech director. And the next biggest, the next kind of full-scale conference that we had in Singapore, there were about 50 or so people there, and it was probably, I'm going to say 60% were either data analysts or tech directors or tech-related folk, and then we had probably 20% that were senior leadership, and then another maybe 20-ish, 15-20% that were a variety of things, whether it be the head of department or it could be a teacher or instructional coach or something like that. And now the shift has definitely broadened. And so it's really hard to say that it's just data analysts. The data analytics or data tech director role has kind of decreased to about maybe 25% of the overall people that attend. And I think that's because we have structured the conference in a way that is meeting the learning needs of a variety of different people. And so we do have the technical, if you want to know about data lakes and API keys and dashboards, then yeah, we've got that. Sure, we can do that. And you can code in Python or whatever. We can do all those things. But we can also talk about the theory behind why are we collecting the data, and talk about, we can talk more about the pedagogical side of things. And we can talk not just about academic data, but how do we look at social emotional? Are we looking at our systems? When we go to KL in a couple of months, the conference is going to be around creating efficient data ecosystems. And that's a completely different thread. And we had a thread on AI and education and educational data. So we're really trying to go into schools that want to host and looking at what they're doing. What are they doing in their school? Why are we coming there? And then whatever they're focusing on, we try to build our theme around that. And because we're doing that, that has completely diversified our community, which is really great because we get lots of different perspectives. And that's the whole thing, was to break down the silos.
And the audience you're working with, I wonder, and this might be an unfair question, is there a difference between what the audience you're now working with wants to learn about data in schools and what maybe from your experience you feel that they need to learn about data in schools?
That's a good question. I haven't really thought about that. It's not what I want. It's not what I think that they need. I don't think that's the right approach to take. I think we're a community that learns from each other. And so whatever they want, that's what we should be doing.
But, we were talking about blind spots earlier on. And if I don't feel humble and curious and brave enough to seek out blind spots, then I might seek out and want stuff that is talking about the stuff that I'm already thinking about. I might not be taken to those blind spots. I might not be taken to those places outside of my own comfort zone. So I think that's what I was getting at a little bit, when something becomes a trend or a fad or the thing that everyone is talking about, then it's easy for educators and leaders to think, right, well, that's what I need to hear more and more and more and more and more about. And I suppose that's what I was wondering. Is there do you see a role for data in schools in consciously, intentionally kind of prodding and poking your audience sometimes out of its comfort zone? Say, I know you're crying out to hear about these things again and again, but we're also going to explore this thing that maybe you hadn't thought of. I suppose that's what I'm getting at. If it's audience driven entirely, then there's a risk that it does the opposite of unsettling and pushing towards those blind spots.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. To answer that, I think we've been fortunate to have quite a variety of people come and talk and share. And I think some of those people have come in with those ideas that are not the mainstream, and they've come in poking and prodding a bit. And I think that has just, I know that in Frankfurt we had 3 pretty profound speakers talk about AI and how AI is not necessarily a great thing, and how and why, and really pulling the curtain back, and people that know deeply about how AI works and how it functions just were able to pull it apart and show us, this is why, this is what it does, this is what's good. Not that it's all bad, but you need to be aware that AI will tell you great things. It'll tell you that you're always right. It'll tell you that you're always wonderful, even if you're wrong. You have to be aware of that, and we have to be teaching students about that. And so some of those types of things are the things that come up in the conversations and that come up through the people that we invite to come and speak. But I understand what you're saying, and it does make me wonder if we do need to be a bit more strategic about who we have our community exposed to, just so that we can continue to poke and prod and push the boundaries, because you are right. We don't need to come around and necessarily pat each other on the back all the time. We do need to be challenged, right? I think as humans, we want to be challenged and we want to be stay curious and we want to be questioning what's going on around us so that we can make better sense of it.
That's really interesting. I suppose that's what I was trying to tease out.
If you're a school leader, your day probably starts with questions. Who needs support? Where are the risks? What needs my attention right now? IntelliSchool helps answer those questions in real time by bringing attendance, well-being, behaviour and learning into one connected platform. IntelliSchool cuts through the noise and gives leadership teams the clarity they need. Fewer spreadsheets, smarter decisions, and more time to focus on what really matters, your students. Lead with confidence using IntelliSchool.
Chris, I think you were actually addressing that a little bit earlier in the conversation when you were talking about how school leaders would come to you with data requests and you would respond, well, why? What are you trying to do here? And when you ask that question, why, it's not that you're critiquing them, but it allows them to critique themselves, to think through, like, do I have a clear why here? And then if they don't, then suddenly, again, that gap between where they thought they were and where they actually are suddenly becomes revealed a little bit in terms of having a clear strategy or purpose for data and alignment between the data that they're interested in and the data that maybe they care about. Suddenly that becomes much more clear.
Yeah, I think you're right in that's kind of the idea there, right? It's not necessarily to challenge them, but just to help them see things from a different point of view and help them, as you said, kind of reflect and reevaluate themselves. I think one thing that, at least with what we try to do, is there's this balance between, one, we want to question, sometimes we need to question people and why they're doing what they're doing. But also we are trying to create an environment where people that might sometimes be otherwise reluctant to share what they're doing, we want to be able to create an environment where they feel comfortable to be able to share what they're doing, even if they think it isn't a big deal, or they think it's dumb, or they think that, everybody already knows this. We want to create an environment where they can come and do that. And so I guess it's just finding that unique balance between those things.
That's one of the things I loved about the Delhi event when I was there, was the informality of it. And the creation of that safe space where everyone feels able to share for a minute, for 10 minutes, for longer, without fear of whether that will be, disapproved of or shot down or not welcomed. So I think that is important, because some people love the sound of their own voice and some people really shy away from the sound of their own voice. So creating that safe space where all of those people still feel able to speak, I think that is something special that I've noticed about it all.
As the conference grows, like we started out with, like I said, 14 people, then it was 50, then it was 60, then it was 75, then it was 85, and Frankfurt got up to be 130 people. And so to be able to create that environment of being able to do that was a bit of a challenge. And so we're now at this crossroads of trying to decide, like, what is the optimal number of people to attend to still have a quality conference, but also more of that informal engagement. Yeah, we're trying to figure out that balance.
The conference is evolving. The use of data in schools in general is evolving. What are some of the things that you find yourself excited about coming up in the next months and years?
It's fascinating. I feel like, and maybe this is just with learning anything, and I think about like learning languages. I've luckily enough to be able to speak Japanese fluently, and when I was learning Japanese or learning anything, you have this point where you are learning something and you're excited about learning it, and then you get to a point where you have a certain level of understanding and you're okay, and then you learn a little bit more, and there's like this next level that you're trying to, this next wall that you're trying to hop over, and then you hop over that wall, and then you learn a little bit more, and that just continually grows. And I feel like for me, around data analytics, data visualization in schools, I've gotten to the point where I feel like I kind of know, I feel pretty comfortable with what I know right now, but I also know I can see that next wall coming. And I can see like there's a bunch of stuff that I've got to figure out, and it's all new, it's all changing. And I'm a little bit scared maybe. Like I feel comfortable and I feel like I know what I know right now, but what is out there? What else do I need to learn? How am I going to keep up with things? And so maybe just continuing this community and continuing to learn from each other, that's what we need to do, and is to keep keep growing as a community so we can all upskill ourselves so that we're prepared for what's next. Because I don't know what's next, really. I want to know what your hope is. Matthew, what do you hope to see?
I hope that we can broaden our understanding of what data is. I hope that we can develop more and more humility rather than more and more certainty. Because it seems to me that the things we're trying to measure, if you like, learning, well-being, belonging, these are messy and ultimately immeasurable. So I hope that we wrestle with the discomfort, the contradictions inherent within that. We're trying to measure the immeasurable. So recognizing that it is immeasurable is something that I really hope we will embrace. Paul was talking about sensory data earlier. I've loved reading about Mina Salami's work on sensuous data, and it's digging and diving into what do we know through our gut, what do we know through our heart, and that's what I hope. That sure, the processing of number and the visualizing of number is really exciting, and I think it's really fun, and I think we can learn so much from it. But I hope that we can also explore with the same appetite what we can learn with our heart, what we can learn with our gut. I suppose that would be mine. If we bring this to a close, Chris, I wonder if we could just ask one final question. We're recording here the first episode of Data Talks, the Data in Schools podcast. Why does the sector need a Data in Schools podcast? There are an awful lot of education podcasts out there, probably far more than there are listeners to listen to them. So why do we need this podcast?
I think that we have information to share. I think that people will seek out information if it's there. And if we have the capacity to be able to share different perspectives, maybe that aren't being shared, then maybe that's why we do it. And I don't know that we do it to try to get a bunch of people to listen to it necessarily. I think it's a good way for us to also process the things that we're going through to help us understand. I think that when you talk to yourself in your head, it all makes sense, but then when the words come out of your mouth, sometimes it doesn't. And I think that these interactions and these conversations are for us to better understand also the worlds that we're living in when it comes to data in schools. And if there are people on the periphery that happen to pick it up and listen to it and enjoy it, then that's awesome.
Well, that's what I love about this idea. You talked about earlier about how you started with the small conference and that reached a small number of people. Then you went to gradually bigger and bigger conferences in more and more countries, and that reached a bigger number of people. And then you're looking now at those intersessional spaces, virtual spaces, whereby you can reach people who perhaps couldn't come to one of those events. So whilst I absolutely love what you've said about the recording of a podcast being a means of intellectual processing for the speakers on that podcast, and I certainly experience that every time I'm either hosting or speaking on a podcast, so I love that. I also love the kind of, I suppose, the enfranchisement, the democratization of this space that can happen through adding a podcast to the Data in Schools stable, because there'll be people who either didn't have the capacity, the resources, the money, the time, the connections, the support to come to an event, and therefore maybe they might see the online spaces as something that they need to attend a conference to access. Whereas a podcast, the more people we can get listening to it, is that really judgment-free, democratic, open space where as many people as possible can engage with the ideas that we're talking about here. So that's what I love about it. Why do we need this podcast, Paul?
Well, I'm going to go with a purely selfish reason. I love picking the brains of smart people. And this gives me an opportunity to go all around the world and pick the brains of some of the best thinkers about data in schools and education. And then we can just share those learnings with everybody else. It's like, find someone great to talk to and then invite everyone in for the ride. And so hopefully other people will enjoy the conversation and we'll get something out of it.
And one of the best bits about any journey are the first steps you take on it. So this conversation today, for me, are the first steps on a journey that lays before us, about which I'm immensely excited. And so it's great to be taking those steps with both of you.
So just want to say thank you so much for your time, Chris, and good luck with all of your great work with data in schools.
All right, thank you.
Tune in next time as we continue our data conversations with educators and thought leaders from around the world.